In this video, I'll be going through some things and tricks that you may want to know for your IB MYP Language and Literature e-assessment. So I'll be going through each of the tasks, in which task 1 is the analytical questions and compare and contrast essay. Task 2 is producing a literary text, and task 3 is producing a non-literary text. So starting off with the compare and contrast essay for task 1, the way I used to write it in order to score well is I utilized the block method, in which there will be a total of 4 paragraphs. The first paragraph will be an introduction to both of the texts, as well as an introduction to the prompt that the question gives you. And the first body paragraph would be on the first text, which is the literary text. So I would analyze the literary devices utilized in the text and how it connects to the prompt. Then the second body paragraph would be an analyzing the non-literary text and how cinematic techniques, because it's usually a film, documentary, some type of video, were used in order to portray the prompt as well. And the final concluding paragraph will be discussing the similarities and differences between both the texts. So starting off with the introduction, the first thing that you can include is a hook. The hook can usually be something that's related to the prompt that's given to you. After this would be introducing both of the texts. What's the name of the text and what type of text is it? Is it an article, documentary, film, whatever? And then introducing the background information. What's the author for the literary text and director for the non-literary text? What year was it published in? What's the genre? And then just a short summary of each of the texts, as well as the audiences, which you'll have to infer on your own based off of the information, the type of text it is, as well as the primary and secondary purposes. A novel, for instance, the primary purpose would be to entertain the audience, but the secondary purpose would be depending on what underlying message the novel wants to deliver. So that would be something you would also have to infer. The secondary purpose is usually something that's not as apparent as the primary one. The final thing would be a thesis statement, just to introduce what is going to be discussed in the latter paragraphs. And the first body paragraph, as I mentioned, will focus on the literary text, in which you'll be mentioning 2 literary devices at the very least. You can explain more, but I doubt there will be time for that. And it's good to use the PEL model as it helps you organize your answer, so it helps with criterion B. The model is in which you mention the point, what device was used, and you mention the evidence, so you quote it from the text, and of course you should mention the line and paragraph it is from, and then you give an explanation to show how this line uses this literary device. And after that, you should link it back to the prompt, because in the end, what you're analyzing is how the text manages to show the prompt. And you should also mention the effect on the readers, as in what will the readers feel when they see this, what type of information will they gain, something like that. And a similar thing for body paragraph 2, but because you're focusing on a non-literary text, instead of literary devices, we're focusing on cinematic techniques. And instead of getting evidence from a line and paragraph, since it'll be a type of video, you can mention the timestamp for the evidence. And finally, the concluding paragraph, you'll basically just be reiterating the thesis statement that you included in the introduction, but sort of in a different manner in order to avoid using the same sentence structure or same words, just to avoid repetition. And then after that, you should mention similarities and differences. To be honest, this same sentence structure can be copied for whatever text that you're analyzing. You just have to fill in the gaps. Because both of the text, the way you analyze it, you'll be analyzing it in a way where it'll focus on the same prompt, because the question wants you to analyze the text in a way that they show this prompt. So of course, that's a similarity. However, the difference between the texts would be the techniques that they use, because the techniques that are used to create the 2 types of text will be different. Text 1 will naturally focus on figurative language, which is the same as literary devices, while text 2 will naturally focus on cinematic techniques. So this is a way that you can structure your answer in order to show similarities and differences. And after you mention similarities and differences, one thing that you can do to sort of have a better concluding paragraph is you can mention which text did a better job at portraying the prompt. So you can say that although both the author and filmmaker were effective in utilizing their respective techniques in order to portray this prompt, maybe the filmmaker, or you can change it to the author, did a better job at portraying the prompt for reasons you mentioned yourself. So it's good to give this to make your conclusion a bit better. You can also mention any sort of insight that you've gained from your analysis of both the texts. And just some things to take note of when you're focusing on task 1 is to utilize transitional signals throughout. It'll help organize your text a bit better and make it flow better. And also another thing is to never lose sight of the prompt. Some people may analyze all these techniques and everything, but they don't link it back to the prompt. So although you're analyzing all this, you're not exactly answering the question that the exam is giving you. So you're going off task. So make sure you're always focus on the prompt in the end. And of course, stylistic devices, cinematic techniques, and show the relationship between two texts in terms of the prompt in the concluding paragraph. We always have to go back to the prompt, especially in the concluding paragraph. And mentioning the effect on the readers and audience is very important because it's also mentioned in the rubrics. And of course, similarities, differences, block method, logical manner, organization, sentence structure, vocabulary. And of course, since this is an analytical analysis, you should maintain a formal manner. All the English language use should be formal. And it's best to avoid any grammar and spelling errors if possible. Since it's digital, it should be easy to fix things. And these are just some examples of common cinematic techniques that you could probably identify or see. And the same for figurative language. Of course, there's way more than these, but these are just the common ones. I've also included here a sample for a complete task 1 question, which includes both the analytical questions as well as a compare and contrast essay. So maybe you could try it out yourself to see if you can do it yourself. And I've also included the answers that I gave that managed to score me a high grade so that you could perhaps refer to it. But of course, my answer will be very different from yours because you can really say anything when it comes to language and literature, but it may just give you a new perspective on what you could answer on. So for this specific example, text 1 is an excerpt from The Great Gatsby, and text 2 is a video on a social inequality in the US highlighted by COVID-19. So text 1 is here, and I'll also be playing the video for text 2 so that you can try to answer the questions yourself. So there's 2 questions for text 1, and there's 2 questions for text 2, and there's 1 question for the compare and contrast essay, which I posted my answer to that you can check out. And now I'll just play the video for you guys to see.
Hey Kurt, bring your bottle.
Levon Bryant, night supervisor, makes sure the garbage collectors have bleach, gloves, and masks.
I wipe my steering wheel down. When I get in the house, I make sure I leave everything downstairs so I don't bring nothing up. I go take a shower. I just try to protect my family as best I can.
Each night, as they head out to pick up garbage at grocery stores and hospitals in Brooklyn, they take a risk.
I mean, I'm just be grateful to be working still and to be making money.
Essential workers are more exposed. And as these men haul away bags of soiled hospital gowns, early data is showing that African Americans may be more vulnerable.
When I come to work, you got to be very cautious.
They keep the city going while others sleep, but dense neighborhoods and underlying health problems make some communities more susceptible.
Everyone says that this virus doesn't discriminate, but this society discriminates. The rates of heart disease were not equal, the rates of hypertension were not equal, and all of that makes a person more likely to get COVID-19.
In New York, Latinos are also among the most at risk, particularly here in Corona. Yup, a neighborhood named Corona in Queens. More here have been infected than almost anywhere else in the city.
Everybody's scared. Everybody's petrified. Right?
There's no shortage of customers for Paul's fish shop, but the virus's spread has spared few.
It's really sad because actually on Tuesday my father-in-law passed away because of the COVID. The funeral homes are really full, so we had to put in a waiting list.
You're on a waiting list for a funeral?
Yes.
She's still working at a local hospital, and Diego, well, he can't afford to stop.
We have to pay rent, we have to pay everything. So we have to work.
As the virus in Corona takes its unequal toll. Susan Ormiston, CBC News, New York.
And that was the video for text 2. Now I'll be moving on to task 2. Task 2, which is producing a literary text. So I'll be going through the different type of text types that you may see in this task. So the first one would be a dialogue or a conversation, which is usually the most common one. Or they could just tell you create a story, or in a way, it's just a way of writing narrative writing with dialogue. So generally, the difference between dialogue and conversation is not too big. A dialogue is generally between two people. It could still be between more than two. And conversation has to be between two or more people as well. And just some elements that are usually included in this type of text is you need to mention the setting, which is usually the time and location. Characters, often there's protagonist and antagonist. And when you make the plot, the Freytag's pyramid is quite a good tool to use in order to get a good structure for your plot. And quite often there's a conflict as well as a theme, which is the main idea or underlying message. Conflict is usually connected to the theme. And of course, there's dialogue. There's outer and inner dialogue. Inner dialogue can be represented through italics. And any dialogue should also be isolated from narration. And one important thing for not just this text, but every single type of text that you encounter for this task is literary devices, because especially for this task, you're focusing on creativity and imagination. So these types of techniques will be really important. And this is an example of a question you can get for a literary text focusing on conversation. So you can see here the format is the format of the text itself is not that difficult. There's narration, there's dialogue. So whenever a different person is speaking, you go to another line. Whenever you go from narration to dialogue, you go to another line. And if there's internal dialogue, then you can have it in italics. But other than that, it's just really however you want to write a story. And of course, it's important to know how to use speech marks, like where you put basically the grammar and all that. But that's probably not something you may need to know. But otherwise, it's the general format. You can also try answering this question and see how I've answered it as well, if you want to try it out. And another text type that you can commonly see in task 2 is a screenplay, which is something that's normally written for a film given to actors for them to give them directions on how to act. So the question will normally not make you do many scenes. Maybe they'll ask you to write a screenplay for a certain scene. And the general elements for a screenplay is slug lines, in which you mention there's a line before you start the scene. You mention whether it's happening inside or outside and what's the location as well as the time. I'll show an example as well to show how it is. And narration is always towards the left, and it's always isolated from dialogue as well. Dialogue is always at the center, in which the character's name has to be on top, and all characters' name has to be capitalized. Even if it's mentioned inside the dialogue, it should be capitalized. And parentheticals can also be included to give any additional information. It's usually used to give stage directions in order to show the setting, how a character feels, or any additional information on how the character moves or reacts. And once again, literary devices. So this example, I've already presented this example in a previous video, I believe, but it's an example of how a screenplay is. So you can see that all the names, I guess I forgot to capitalize this name, but all the names should be capitalized, in which this is the slug line. So this is happening outside, so EXT represents exterior. Deserted mountain is the location. Nighttime is the time. So if it's happening inside, then you change this to INT, interior. And then narration should be to the left and separated from dialogue. So the character's name capitalized and the dialogue in the center. And as well as any parenthetical to show any extra action that you want to deliver. And another thing for conversation, it should have more focus on the dialogue rather than the narration. Of course, you need narration to show how the story goes, to give descriptions, but you can tell by the name conversation, the main focus should be on the dialogue. And like the other one, you could try to write this piece of writing if you want to. And another common text that they ask you to focus on is descriptive writing, which is generally quite self-explanatory, in which describes something, someone, or somewhere. It depends on what photo the question gives you. So task 2 is generally, they always give you 2 photos. They ask you to choose the photo, and anything you write should be based off of that photo. But descriptive writing, the difference with conversation dialogue, there's really no need to have any set story. This is in this type of writing, the photos especially important because you're really just describing whatever is there. So you'll have to be really good with sensory language in order to show the image rather than telling. So yeah, there's minimal dialogue. It's mainly just purely description. I don't really have an example for that, but I guess it's self-explanatory. And another thing is also an interior monologue, also known as internal monologue. This is also quite self-explanatory, in which it's mainly just the character's inner thoughts and feelings. So it's not so focused on the narration because it's a first-person POV. So you talk from your perspective and you focus on your thoughts and feelings with just sort of minimal narration to show where the story is going, what's happening. So here are just some things that you may want to take note of for task 2. Is that you should always be describing what is happening in the image really well, because this is one of the criteria for the task. If you're not describing what's happening in the image, you're going off task. If you're not answering the question, you're going off task. So even if you're really creative, you're using lots of stylistic devices, if you don't describe everything that's happening in the image, you may lose marks from that. And there'll always be an option to choose which image you're choosing. So by chance you don't choose it, you may not be awarded any marks for the task. So always be careful to choose the image correctly. And you should be creative and imaginative for how you answer the question. Always include stylistic devices, sensory language, and you should maintain an appropriate register and style depending on what the question is asking you to do. Most of the time, literary devices often have an informal register and style because it's focusing on some narrative, some story. And then moving on to task 3, which is producing a non-literary text. One of the text types that may come out is a magazine article, in which, honestly, there's no proper format. As long as when you look at it and you think it's a magazine article, that will honestly be enough. But some things that you may want to include are heading, subheadings, lead, byline, date, and you can also just get creative with the font style, font size. You can add bullet points, you can bold things, underline things, just to show differentiation, because there's limited things with what you can do in the e-assessment software, but you can try to make do with it. And this is an example of a question involving a magazine article. It's a question that you can see I included the title of the magazine, the heading, subheading, a summary of what's happening in the interview, and just using bolding some words, making it italics, just things to separate and differentiate it a bit so it sort of looks like an article. You can try out this question as well. And of course, the author, whoever wrote the article, and the date it was released. This is written with the assumption that it's done during the time of The Great Gatsby. So it's featuring Gatsby or Tom, which are characters from the book. So that's why I wrote the date to be 19/20/22 because at the time the characters were in. And another text type would be a blog post, which sort of is similar to an article. It's really just the title, who's the author, when was it released, and introduction, and you mention the information. The only difference is an article would probably be more formal, while a blog post would be more informal. You focus a lot on your thoughts and you have more of an interaction with the audience compared to an article where you just provide the information. So compared to task 2, task 3, it's important for you to be able to differentiate what register and tone you need to give. Because for the literary text, most of the time it's a story. It's really easy to do that. For task 3, you have to be able to differentiate on your own. When should you use informal language? When should you use formal language? When should you use semi-formal language? It's up to you to decide. And another another text type that you should take note of is a proposal. From what I know, the time before I took my e-assessment, this text type had come twice for task 3 before I did it. It didn't come when I did it, but it came twice before me. So it's a text type that you can take notice of. Generally, it's a written plan or idea for an event or project. The components of this text type is usually you include first an abstract and a summary of the project you're focusing on. Just a general description without too much detail is enough. And then a statement of need, which includes background information of the problem that you're trying to solve through this project. Then the target audience, the goal, proposed solution. So how exactly are you going to go about this? And what do you hope to achieve through these steps? Future development, what type of development are you expecting from this? And signature, just your name, email, phone number, stuff like that. So here's one practice that I did for proposal writing. It's not an actual e-assessment paper, but it's a practice that I did on writing a proposal. So it's good that although a proposal itself doesn't have that much of a specific format, it's always good to have this sort of format because it's good that the examiner can tell what type of text it is just looking from the way you organize your writing. So this is the way I organized this question. So you can take a look at how you can answer for everything. And then one more text type that you can take notice of is a product review. So a product review has a more of a specific, or not really, but there is a more format that you should take notice of. And the register and style for a product review, more so than something like a proposal, is sort of semi-formal, in which you're giving information, you're giving a lot of information, but you're also giving your opinion because it's a product review, so you're focusing a bit on yourself. So it's semi-formal in a sense where you're formal at times, but you're informal at times too. So that's something you should be able to take note of when you're writing it. So you can generally have 4-5 paragraphs for a product review, in which the first paragraph you can talk about the problem and a promise that the product has. So you start with a hook, and then you outline the problem that a reader may be facing, and then you outline the promise that the product that you're reviewing may bring, and you just give a brief introduction of the product as well as a thesis statement for everything that you're about to discuss from that point onwards. And then you give a description of the product in which you give specific details of its purpose, any practical details, and you'll have to identify the target demographic and also outline benefits that the product brings to the target demographic. And then, of course, you're reviewing, so you'll have to talk about both advantages and disadvantages. You can talk about the problems faced by the target demographic in more detail this time and explain how the product can be used to solve these problems. You can also talk about the other functions of the product and how it can go even beyond this problem. And disadvantages, you can explain how the product does not completely fill the void or does not completely solve the problems mentioned. But you could also provide alternatives or solutions to said problems. And finally, the most important paragraph would be the verdict, because you're giving a review. So you have to say, is it a good product or not? So you comment on whether the product lives up to its promise. You sum up all the points mentioned before, and you can acknowledge any weaknesses on your part as the reviewer. And finally, you should give a rating. Out of 5 stars, 10 stars, it doesn't really matter, but you'll have to give a rating at the end. And this is an example of a task 3 question involving a product review, as well as my answer. I did the product review on Sony headphones, and I follow this exact format, this exact structure. So you can take a look at the way I structured my answer in order to use this format. And another text type that came before is persuasive speech, in which things that you can use, obviously you have to use literary devices. You can also use Monroe's motivated sequence, in which the 5 steps are: you get attention, you hook the audience, you establish the need, you mention a problem, what's the problem, you satisfy the need, you give a solution to the problem, and you visualize the future. How better off would the future be with this solution, or how worse off would it be without the solution? And then you call for action. And then you can also include persuasive appeals, which is ethos, pathos, logos. Ethos focuses on credibility, pathos on emotional appeal, and logos using logic and reasoning. And you should make connections to the global context and include keywords from the global context. This is something that doesn't only apply to a persuasive speech, it applies to every single text in task 3. They will always give you a global context to focus on. The entire paper is based off of a global context, but task 3 is the one where the question will specifically give you the global context and tell you to write the text, your answer, based off of the global context. So you should always take note of the global context and make connections with it throughout, and if possible, include certain keywords from the global context inside. And for your introduction, you can include a hook, greeting, mention your role, who are you? The question may give you a role, tell you you are a student doing this or whatever, and introduce the topic, then a thesis statement, and of course, since it's a speech, you say thank you at the end. And finally, a letter. This is the format that came when I did my e-assessment, hence why I'm including this. So I don't really have any writing of mine where I included a writing, since since letter it's not something that came before, I believe. So I wasn't really prepared for it, but you can probably find the format anywhere online, but this is generally a format of a letter that you can keep in mind of. And finally, things to take note of for task 3. You should always be making references to the global context, and just focusing on the way you craft your sentences, paragraphs, imagination, creativity, and literary devices. Literary devices in task 3 is a bit tricky because it depends on how formal you'll have to be with your register and style. If you have a text where you have to be quite formal, there's a limitation to the literary devices that you can use because some will make you come off as informal. So you may have to be careful with this aspect. And of course, you can focus on extensive examples and details depending on what text type you get. And yeah, that's all I have to say for language and literature e-assessment. I think that's really all that you have to know, because anything beyond this really is whatever that will come in your examination on the spot.